Sam Seder on the Majority Report on the phone. Pleasure to welcome back to the program the editor of Current Affairs, a periodical you should all be subscribing to, and the author of Why You Should Be a Socialist, Nathan J. Robinson. Welcome to the program, Nathan.
Oh, it's so nice to be back with you, Sam.
So, all right, Nathan, I enjoyed this. I think that this is, just broadly speaking, we get calls from people who are like, what book should we read if I want to become, a socialist or a democratic socialist or a social democrat or something to that effect. And I feel like this is a great sort of gateway book for people. And not only do I think that, I don't think it's just why you should be a socialist, but it's sort of like how. Like almost like a practical guide, half of it is. But let's just start with this. And I know you don't get too caught up on what a socialist is. But with that said, just give us a vague notion, if you will, or at least a decent one. And contrast and compare for me social democrat versus democratic socialist.
Sure. Yeah. Well, just the thing you said, I mean, I get those all the time, people saying, what should I read? How do I find out, what these things are? And this is sort of my come and join the left book. So even if we don't get, bogged down in the terminological disputes, for the broad left, and this is also sort of this is what the left is, this is what we believe, this is what we're fighting for thing. But so, immediately people get to, okay, well, all right. So what is socialism? And of course, it's frustrating. That's a difficult question because socialists have spent the entire history of the socialist movement arguing over what socialism is, with some socialists pointing at each other and saying, you're a social democrat, you're not a real socialist. And so, I mean, I start with, socialists sort of start with Eugene Debs. And they start with a few kind of principles. The thing that he said about, while there's a lower class, I am in it. While there's a soul in prison, I am not free. So there's this very strong animating ethic of solidarity. This workers of the world unite. This looking at the kind of the proletarian class of the world and really disliking the existence of a class hierarchy, the existence of a small number of people who own stuff and a much larger number of people who sort of do the labor and don't reap so many of the rewards. Now, the term social democracy is a little frustrating because a lot of socialists have called themselves social democrats. The German Social Democratic Party, it was a socialist party. Currently, the Prime Minister of Finland is both a member of the Social Democratic Party, which is a member of the Socialist International. So these distinctions aren't always clear. And I think like Bernie Sanders, for example, is both a social democrat and a democratic socialist. But the way that I would define, like, if you're a socialist, the core if you're a socialist, is socialists are kind of utopians. They're kind of real radicals who look, many years into the future and who sort of dream of, like, what would happen if we fulfilled all of our core principles, if we had a world in which people were treated fairly and had what they needed. And so that's kind of where we start, is with this very, very radical vision for a different world. And I think it's true that if you find people who just call themselves social democrats, they don't quite have that same animated sense of, like, we have a very powerful vision of what, socialists are always saying, a better world is possible.
Right.
And they think about, like, what would it mean if you didn't have a division between the owners and the workers? What would it mean if you had a world without borders? What would it mean if you had a world without war? And that's kind of what you'll find in a lot of socialists that characterizes the tendency.
And Nathan, you're breaking up a little bit. Can we just call you back on your phone? We're gonna
Sure.
We'll do that. We're gonna take a quick break, folks, and people just bear with us. All right, appreciate it. Thanks. Sorry about that. All right. So Nathan, so with that said, with the specifics out of the way, and it's funny because I sometimes take phone calls from libertarians, and the first thing that happens is it takes like about 15, 20 minutes before, after they're done slagging every other libertarian who's ever called this program or been interviewed on this program, or every other libertarian I've talked to and told me why their libertarianism is not libertarianism. And then they have a very specific libertarianism that they espouse that involves like 3 or 4 different adjectives. And so I appreciate the idea that socialism can be sort of a broad term, or at least you perceive it that way. And I think that's one of the things I liked about your book, is that it's sort of got a wide mouth funnel on some level, and trying to bring a lot of people in. Let's talk about this notion, though, of utopianism, and because that is one of the things that I think, as I have talked to people over the years, is that, and partly because I'm not quite a boomer, but I know that it makes people feel comfortable to think that I am. But I think there is a sort of like, I have been trained to have a lack of imagination, and one of the things that you really promote is to have more of one in terms of like what we would want.
Right. Yeah, I think it's so important, actually. I mean, the word utopianism is considered dismissed as just idle dreaming, but I think a lot of social progress comes because there are some people who are able to imagine things being very, very different, right? Imagining the end of slavery requires seeing far beyond what's in front of your eyes and really envisioning what a different way of arranging human social relations would be like. And I mean, some people have pointed out that, like, if you existed in a world before the public library would sound as crazy as some of the schemes that socialists are putting forward today, right? We just want a place where you get free books, you don't have to pay, they just hand them to you, you get to take, right? I mean, free college sounds pretty similar today, and people are saying, well, how on earth would you pay for that, right?
Right.
You're going to give free access to all books to everyone, right? But the socialists are the ones who have said, well, let's think about what do we really want out of life? What would a good world look like? The globe is kind of, in the form that we've been given, is kind of a Garden of Eden. It is a place with, as George Orwell said, enough provision. It's a raft sailing through space with provisions enough for everyone. So what would our ideal world look like? And that causes socialists to say, well, war shouldn't be taken for granted. It should be considered a problem that we have to eliminate. Borders, militarized borders are kind of the same way. And can we imagine a world without these things? And that's why you see in every generation, the people who are labeled the socialists are the ones dragging things in the right direction historically, right? So it's Bernie Sanders and AOC who are the only ones pushing an adequate climate plan, or the only ones saying, let's rethink the whole healthcare system from the bottom up. And I think that's always really helpful. The socialists were once the only ones saying, let's have an 8-hour day and a 40-hour week and a weekend. And then those things became normal because people were able to dream of things that other people said were impossible.
And what do you say? And one of the things that I do like about, and I have to say, I also enjoyed, I read one of your reviews, the one where you gave yourself 5 different reviews from 5 different perspectives. But one of the things I do like about the book, too, is that you sort of build in some of the critiques that you would get. Yeah. And so let's talk about, you sort of break down what conservatism is, what liberalism is. You say that conservatism is cruel, that liberalism is oblivious. Walk us through that, and then let's talk about the conservative critique, and the liberal critique for that matter, of this utopianism.
Okay. So, I mean, conservatism, I describe it as cruelty because I think even though every conservative is always saying, no, it's just, we're just realistic, right? We just understand human nature. But in every generation, you find the conservatives being the ones who rationalize and explain away and justify whatever today looks to us to be cruel and appalling. And so I go through some conservative writings, and you find, real justifications for like why people deserve their suffering or why it's okay not to care. And, there's this famous book, The Rhetoric of Reaction, that talks about conservative rhetoric, which is all about like how every scheme for social improvement is going to fail. And they say that about anything, no matter what. So part of making progress is rejecting that kind of categorical belief that all attempts at social progress are destined to fail. And, I mean, I'm a pragmatist, and saying pragmatically, okay, well, that's not true. We don't want to adopt the conservative position here. We do want to make social progress carefully, but we have to still believe in it. Now, liberalism, liberalism is a term that has applied to everyone from, to Friedrich von Hayek, the classical liberals, to, Barack Obama, to Elizabeth Warren, to so what does it really mean? Well, what I do try and do is distinguish where the people who call themselves socialists differ from people who call themselves liberals. Now, they often share a lot of overlap. There's more overlap between Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren than there is between Bernie Sanders and Barack Obama, or Bernie Sanders and Amy Klobuchar, right? But, what is the dividing line that says that Elizabeth Warren isn't a socialist and Bernie Sanders is? And one of the dividing lines is a real antagonism to, as I said, class divides and hierarchy, right? So socialists have always been the ones that look inside the workplace and say, like, we need democratically controlled workplaces. We need to eliminate the distinction between owners and workers, landlords and tenants, right? So like a liberal is the one who wants regulation, who says that there should be, rent regulation. We should, make sure that landlords treat their tenants well. The socialist is the one that says the idea that some people own the houses and the other people have to pay them rent, that whole distinction needs to eventually be broken down. Socialists have always also been, because they have this workers of the world unite perspective, they have been way more consistently anti-war than people who describe themselves as liberals. And you really see that, you were just talking about Iran, you really see that in the presidential candidates' responses to the attack on Soleimani, which is Bernie Sanders is very much more consistently anti-war and anti-American imperialism than any of the other candidates.
One of the things, just to circle back around to the conservatism and the human nature argument, which I find fascinating, is that there's a claim that we're just talking about human nature, but it really isn't just that. It is a moral judgment upon human nature. Because if you just took human nature as it was, you'd accept that there are some people who are not going to be as materially productive as others, right? Like that's just human nature. And you would accept that and simply say, still they deserve a certain, basic level of human dignity that we all do, or that we should all share one that is at least within certain bounds of being, recognizable to each other. But the conservative mentality is, it seems to me, to exploit human nature and to perceive it as problematic in some way.
There's a kind of implicit social Darwinism that says that people deserve what they get in the big sort of brutal competitive struggle. Milton Friedman said, our philosophy is not from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. It's from each according to what they are capable of producing in the market to what they're capable of producing in the market. But what that means is that people who are children, who are disabled, who are old, who are caregivers, they don't get any rewards, right? And we see that in the market. Those are the people who end up poor. So there is this, and the people who end up with the most end up being the people who are most willing to prey on and exploit other people. They're not actually the innovators, right? If you look at the billionaires, they're generally not inventors. They're not people who invent products for the most part. They are people who are capable of, as Peter Thiel says, cornering a market, getting between people. Peter Thiel invented PayPal, right, which is just a middleman that siphons off some money. So there are those sorts of people. There's a real idea that not only are we motivated by self-interest, which is not true. Anyone who knows people knows that that's just not really true. We're a cooperative species for the most part, except the libertarians. But that self-interest is legitimate. It is legitimate to solely pursue your own ends. There is a stamp of approval on this human nature, this brutal human nature. And that stamp of approval allows us to justify, anything you do that makes money is good. There's no distinction between price and value, right? Anything, the amount someone pays for something, that's what it's worth. The amount that you're paid, that's what you're worth. If a CEO is paid, 300 times more than their employees, it's not because they have just been able to exploit the nature of power relations in society. It's because they are 300 times more important and better. And so there's this sense that power and strength kind of are virtue, and that's obviously very frightening.
Right. Well, I asking that because I want to sort of with that frame, right, with the social Darwinism frame and that sort of the value and price frame, right? Because one could argue that the reason why CEOs are getting 300 times, X or whatever the number is, right? The reason why the $10 million is because there is a virus in the market. There's a flaw in the market. There's a certain asymmetry, and that the number shouldn't be 300 times X. It should really be 100 times X or something to that effect. And so where on that spectrum, when you describe liberalism, what is it there? Because where I'm ultimately going to this is there a precondition that you have to have in terms of a way that you view the world to be a socialist, to have a socialistic perspective on things? But talk about that liberalism first.
Yeah. So I would say that if the difference between the rhetoric that you hear coming out of socialists and coming out of people who would be categorized as liberals on this particular issue would be, liberals would probably point out that, this compensation seems unfairly high. We probably want to curb, but there would be a very strong appeal to companies to regulate themselves. This is why you see this business roundtable thing, which is calling on corporations to be their best selves.
Right. This is the corporate roundtable. 50 CEOs got together and said, "We can do better, guys," and I do mean guys.
Yes. Yeah. We're good. We're the good corporations. We're going to live up to our values. We don't fully accept that the only thing a corporation is supposed to do is maximize shareholder value. There are stakeholders and whatever. The socialists are very critical of things like this because socialists basically, as I say, want to dismantle the class division. So even if a CEO is a somewhat better person and gets a little bit less money, they're still within the workplace a dictator, right? I mean, it's still an undemocratic workplace. Elizabeth Anderson has this great book, Private Government, about how corporations, if we conceive of them as private governments, which we probably ought to because people spend so much of their time being ruled by the rules of their workplace, the structure of a corporation is the structure of a dictatorship. You don't get to vote for your boss. There's no democracy there. If you don't like them, tough. Your option is to leave, just as in a country, your option is to either migrate or stick around and put up with it. And so that's kind of the difference between the way that a socialist looks at these things and a way that a liberal looks at it. Is socialists talk a ton about power and who has it, and have you really changed who has power? And just because you've got the benevolent dictator, have you really solved the ultimate underlying problem? And the other thing that socialists say is that there's kind of a naivete to believing that you can solve things while keeping power relations pretty intact, right? So if you have if you have better CEOs, they might try and incorporate stakeholder interests or what have you, but ultimately, if a corporation is structured to where it's supposed to maximize shareholder value, there's going to be a shareholder revolt if you go too far, right? The CEO of ExxonMobil right? Their job, like if they can't come out and say, like, I think that what our company should be dismantled, right? It's impossible. There are incentives. The reason that, like, the tobacco industry and the fossil fuel industry lied so much and manipulated the public was that they kind of had to. That was the nature of the institution. If you wanted to remain profitable, you had to find every possible way to keep the public from revolting against what you do.
I mean, yes, I think that's well put. I mean, it's nice that these 50 CEOs get together and decide that, you know, they're going to really make a strong effort to do better. But why do they get to choose? Like, why do they get to set the parameters? You know, why, you know, it's really just sort of asking, like, why is it like this when it doesn't really have to be? I mean, corporations do not exist in nature. They are a social construct. They are not even a social construct. They're a governmental construct. They're
made by the state. The state gives them limited liability and then enforces that.
Okay, so if a conservative is one who, in many respects, applauds this sort of this power structure, because what it does is, in some ways, I mean, really, it's not that far from the monarchy, right? It's like, it's blessed. If it exists, it exists because God wanted it that way. We may have substituted the word market for God, but the market is moral. God is moral. If you're poor, you're immoral. If you lost the raffle, it's because God didn't want you to have the winning ticket, that type of thing. And liberals say, like, well, we think our God should be a little bit more merciful. And so we're okay with the structure, but we want to take the rough edges off. Or we want to take a lot of the edges off, but the structure will remain. If socialists, broadly speaking, want to change that power structure, does there need to be a precondition? Like, I mean, is this just simply something that you are born with, or is this something that you, I mean, honestly, like, you know, is it, I mean, is this just something that you adopt intellectually?
I don't, that's hard to answer, right? Because that requires a bit of psychoanalysis. I don't know why. I mean, I do know, I talk about how, like, all the people I know who have been socialists have been people who really have this kind of deep disgust with so many systemic features of the world around them they see, right? And if, another example, I think of the liberalism, socialism divide was, I was thinking, like, if you lived under feudalism, liberalism would be like minimum wages and maximum hours for peasants. And socialism would be like the entire idea of feudalism, of having power concentrated in the Lord, is just wrong and despicable. And so I do think, like, I talk about how, like, socialists are kind of unreasonable people, right? I mean, Bernie Sanders, right? I used to not think he deserved the label socialist. I really come around to it because as you read the history of socialism, you see that a lot of the socialists, like people like Eugene Debs, are the people like Bernie Sanders who are standing there alone on the floor of the House going, like, I will not tolerate another war. They are people who have just like this uncontrollable discontent, and this real feeling that something around them is very troublingly wrong, because they have that utopian vision, because they look at the world and they see the difference between what is and what could be. And that's why so many of us are so unpersuaded when people like Steven Pinker or Nicholas Kristof go, like, but things are getting better on this chart. And you go, well, things are getting slightly better on the chart, but actually the real measure is the gap between what is possible and what we have managed to do. And that gap might actually be growing all the time, because, like, the more, as you increase production, as it's easier and easier to provide for everyone, it becomes more and more morally grotesque that you haven't.
I mean, that is, I think, that is the nub, right? It's not where you are in a vacuum. It is where you are relative to where you could be. based upon the potential or resources that you could describe you as an individual, it could describe you as a society or a planet for that matter. I think that's a great point. So one of the things also I like about what you've written is that you build in some of these critiques. What about, why would we want to be like Venezuela, where we have a former Speaker of the House is trying to climb fences and getting kicked out of Parliament? Why would one want that, or address the critique that we wouldn't want the social safety net to become a hammock?
Yeah, okay. Well, the Venezuela thing, the challenge that I pose is like, okay, if socialism is a kind of, if economic socialism, right, which is distinguished from that kind of moral socialist instinct, is like worker ownership, like, was it worker ownership that was the problem in Venezuela? And the answer is no, it was authoritarianism. The problem was authoritarianism. And so authoritarian socialism is just as much of a problem as right-wing authoritarian fascism. Authoritarianism really does destroy a country. And so that should be something that we all oppose, right? Which is why I identify with what is called the libertarian socialist tradition. And those people have always been the ones who every time someone in the name of socialism, in the name of empowering workers, ended up crushing the workers, as Bakunin said, beating people with a stick but calling it the people's stick. We have said, no, the problem is that the state is beating people with a stick. So, and I also think that it's very cherry picked, right? Because everyone was looking at Venezuela while no one was looking at poverty reduction in Bolivia. Nobody looks at the activities of socialists in the United States, right? Like Bernie Sanders was an incredibly effective mayor of Burlington. He's widely praised. He started a community land trust in the name of socialism. And was he an authoritarian? Did he act like Lenin? No, he didn't. Socialists ran the city of Milwaukee for many years. They ran it really well. So, you can't cherry pick. You have to look at the entire history of socialism and say, okay, there is a version of socialism that actually seems to do a lot of good. There is a version of something that is kind of a perversion of the ideals of socialism, and we need to reject that categorically. The social safety net becoming a hammock, it's kind of funny because nobody asks this about capital income. Right. Nobody asks whether, like, the rich getting richer off passive income from capital makes them lazy. Right. Which is so much more income. I really feel like, first, I'm not anti-hammock. Hammocks for all. It seems very, the real serious answer is if you change the nature of work so that work is really enjoyable, so that workplaces don't feel like dictatorships that you have to drag yourself to, if you really, there's nothing inherently miserable about doing tasks, about being productive. It doesn't have to be that way. If you structure something, I'm a workaholic now. I come to work all the time because I have a job where, we are a democratic workplace. We have a very good culture here at Current Affairs, and everyone likes to work because we kind of fix it. Because if you don't have a tyranny, if you're not working for the benefit of someone else, some tiny class of owners, but you're getting the rewards of what you do, then there is an incentive to work. And then it doesn't matter that you've got a safety net because you've also at the same time eliminated the thing that is the disincentive to work, which is that actually having a job turns out to really, really suck when it's such a dehumanizing and alienating experience.
Let me just get back to the sort of the Venezuela question. What is it just a choice? Is there a danger, though, of socialism, what you call libertarian socialism, or democratic socialism, let's say, right, sliding into an authoritarianism? Like, is there what is the ballast that that keeps it from drifting into that type of scenario?
I think it should be the big lesson of the 20th century, right? Not that socialism is bad, but that, like, you need to build into your politics a way of avoiding the slide into authoritarianism and, avoiding rationalizations for crushing dissidents. The thing is that actually the socialists in the United States have a fantastic record on civil liberties. They've always been the ones that have pointed out when the government is unfairly targeting dissidents. Now, the question is, would we do the same thing if we obtained power? And the answer is you have to really make sure that your philosophy is very pro-liberty, is very pro-speech, is very pro-open debate and discussion, and is very anti-state violence. I mean, the thing is, socialists in the United States are mostly prison abolitionists. They're mostly anti-death penalty. They are mostly in favor of massively scaling back the militarization of the police. Well, if you value civil liberties and your worry is creeping authoritarianism, it seems to me like that's the team you should be on, is the team that is trying to release as many people from prison as possible.
Right. And I guess we have, theoretically at least, or I should say, nominally, some example of the potential dangers of authoritarianism in a country that is not socialist like this one. Right? I mean, that's
so funny because, we have the Gulag Archipelago. We've got millions of people. We're the freest country in the world, and we've got so many people in prison, and yet people say, well, what about the possibility that you become a police state? My God, heaven forbid.
Right. All right, let's move on to, here's one more question I have on the book, and then I want to just talk a little bit about the election, because I know you've just written a piece about why Biden is no good in the general, and I want to ask you about Warren and Bernie in that respect. But why do you think this is happening now? Why do you think the Jacobin is, and I'm looking at polling that shows, 11% of Democrats, I think, identify as socialists, which I imagine is up. But certainly we know that a higher percentage of Democrats are okay with socialists. And broadly speaking, what do you think has changed? I mean, is it generational? Is it's simply a function of the context of the times? Or is it both? What is it?
Well, partly it's generational. I mean, I talk about in the book. I talk about my experience growing up during the financial crisis and during the Iraq War, and watching people who were quote unquote liberals and progressive Democrats supporting that war, and also the Obama presidency radicalized the young people who sort of believed in it, and then they saw his foreign policy, and then they saw his education reform quote policy, and they and they're having his healthcare, his compromises on healthcare, and then they realized, okay, well, I'm not a clearly, if this is what being a progressive Democrat is, I'm to the left of this. And then someone who called himself a socialist came along and said, well, I actually have, much bolder plans. And they said, oh, okay, well, then if that's what socialism is, that's what I identify as. So I think Bernie Sanders made a huge difference to this because you saw the discontent in Occupy in 2011. You really saw, that was a lot of frustrated young people gathering and sort of, talking about debt and talking about precarity and the nature of work. But it didn't sort of identify as a socialist movement. And then it wasn't until Sanders' run that you really saw a lot of people coming together under the socialist label and the DSA's membership taking off. And I think it was because people began to see socialism as a coherent vision for what an alternative would be. And yeah, it is mostly young people because young people are the most frustrated. But so that's how I would describe it. I'd say Bernie Sanders has a lot to do with it, and also the nature of growing up in this economy with America's disastrous militaristic foreign policy hanging over us all the time.
Yeah, I mean, it's been fascinating just from my perspective, because the word socialism, I mean, the people identifying in American politics as socialists, I mean, and I say this as someone who who interviewed Bernie on my radio show in 2004, and when we talked about him being, a political independent, I think, but a socialist, and I mean, so he was out there. I don't even think, I think he was as surprised as anybody at how well he did in 2016, frankly. I think maybe even too late to realizing in the context of that race how well he was doing.
Absolutely.
And then suddenly it just caught on like wildfire. It's almost as if there was a tremendous amount of tinder on the ground, and he was he just came up and lit the match again, and this time the context was right.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I mean, you kind of see a kind of an unfortunate parallel in Britain where, like, Jeremy Corbyn spent like 30 years as a backbencher that was suddenly elevated to the leadership, not because he was considered really the best leader, but because there was this tinder, and it was like this, we need everyone, this movement of young radical lefties. And I mean, it turned out like he really struggled to actually then deliver the kind of leadership that mandate requires you to deliver. I think Bernie's actually a much better politician, but it was the same kind of situation where like the undercurrents of the desire for an alternative was just waiting for anyone to come along and say like, I have it, join me.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think in this instance, I mean, I think if there was another version of Bernie, they would be more popular than Bernie at this point. I mean, like if there wasn't, if there wasn't this sort of large gap between, people in their 30s and Bernie in terms of like subscribing to these politics, I think that, that person would be, might be, if there was, if Barack Obama,
if he was 20 years younger, 30 years younger,
right. He would be defeating him, as it were, or she more than likely would be defeating him in that instance. I mean, it's fascinating in that respect. All right. Well, I was going to ask you for the case as to why Bernie Sanders is more electable than Joe Biden, but apparently Matt Iglesias beat you to that today. But let's talk about Biden, because I think Biden's and Bernie seems to be honing in on this right now too. Like, this has been the unspoken belief, I think, frankly, of a huge swath of the Democratic Party. I would include large segments of the establishment, that Joe Biden is just ill-suited to win. And the perception by a significant number of rank-and-file Democrats, and I would say probably the highest propensity voting Democrats, that Joe Biden can win, and that's just speculation on my part, is wrong. Walk us through that.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's understandable why so many prospective Biden voters default to the assumption that he's a pragmatic candidate, right? I mean, he was the vice president, so he ran and won, admittedly with Barack Obama in 2 national elections, and, he's been in Washington forever. He's got, what they consider folksy appeal to win the Midwest and the Rust Belt or whatever. I think it's, as you say, wrong, because if you actually look at Biden's performance in this campaign, it's not just, many of us on the left are like, but he's rambling and incoherent. Well, that's partially true. But it's also that nobody's really enthusiastic for Biden, and I think that really hurt Hillary Clinton in 2016. And Biden has it worse. There were people who were enthusiastic for Hillary, but I don't know that anyone's going around knocking doors in the middle of winter, like dedicating themselves to Joe Biden. That's kind of a joke, right? He has not really much of an operation. His fundraising has been really bad, while Donald Trump has a giant war chest building up. He doesn't really have a message beyond like Trump is a liar. That's no malarkey. So he's got no movement, no message, no organization. No enthusiasm. That's bad, right? And he also has a bunch of really vulnerable spots, just like Hillary Clinton did. I mean, Donald Trump's an anti-establishment candidate. and Biden is like the definite. He's been in Washington since he was 30. He's involved in this, this Ukraine thing, which, like they say, he didn't do anything wrong, but it's like a mess. It looks bad. It's something you have to explain. It's easy to run against and say, like, Joe Biden's a representative of the corrupt establishment. Joe Biden voted for all the shit. Says he didn't. He runs against, like, the Iraq War. I mean, the Iraq War is the is the big thing that Biden now has to pretend. He has to lie and say that he opposed it, right? Because he knows that this is such a weak spot. So he just goes around saying that he opposed the Iraq War from the start. And that's a massive vulnerability if the Republicans just call you out on a massive lie that you're telling all the time, even as your whole campaign is why the other guy is a liar and I'm no malarkey, a return to honesty, dignity, and respectability.
That, to me, that dynamic right there is the biggest problem. It is the way in which he is most like that the matchup between Clinton and Trump is most like the matchup between Biden and Trump, because Biden is running on character, and that means that you are playing in an arena, regardless of whether he could have the greatest character or not. It doesn't matter. He's playing in an arena that is the only arena that Donald Trump knows how to play in, which is, I am going to throw mud at your character, you're going to throw mud at my character, and then Donald Trump wins because he has sort of like an adamant psychotic following who also know that he's going to deliver what is important to them materially, which is essentially a Supreme Court and lower taxes. Those are the two things that they really, you fulfill the entire Republican wish list there. You'll have special interests who want, like, hey, can you get rid of, like, can I dump more toxins in the river? Sure, we can handle that, but that's not a campaign pledge. But the bottom line is that is how you depress votes. You go after, when you're in the arena of character. I think that's what makes Sanders so strong as a candidate against Trump, is that Bernie Sanders is not running on his character. People can project stuff onto his character, but Bernie Sanders is never going up there saying, like, I'm going to restore dignity to the White House. He may have said it, but I don't think people associate it with him. He is going up there and saying, like, I'm going to do certain policies. And Donald Trump is going to say, you're a socialist. But the problem is that Trump does not have a next sentence to that.
Yes, I know.
He can't even explain what that means. He can't say, like, you don't want to cut Medicare. He can't say anything after that.
I'm telling you, I've dreamed of a Bernie Sanders debate against Donald Trump, right? Because, like, Bernie Sanders goes, we're going to deliver for you. Here's what we're going to deliver. You're never going to have to worry about whether you can afford your health insurance anymore. You're never going to have to worry about whether your kids can afford college, right? And what alternative does Donald Trump have beyond the word socialism? He had nothing. And Bernie Sanders is getting to run against the ideal character for him, which is a cartoon of an out-of-touch billionaire who doesn't care about anyone else. It's perfect. And so he's the ideal anti-Trump candidate, not anti any Republican, but Trump specifically. I agree.
I agree. I felt this in 2016.
He was, like, worried about, like, his family coming over, and he's worried about, like, his paycheck with Uber. And I was like, Bernie Sanders has a message for that guy, which is, we're going to fix immigration, we're going to fix your wages. Biden has nothing. Biden has nothing to say to that guy.
The irony is that I think that while Hillary Clinton could have beaten anyone else in the Republican field, I also feel that it's quite possible that anyone else in the Republican field could have beaten Bernie. But I just think that in terms of, I'm talking 2016, but I'm talking in terms of matching up against Donald Trump, Bernie is the only candidate who clearly, and I want to ask you a little bit about Warren before you go, because I think Warren, I think frankly there's been a misstep in her campaign, and I think that they didn't understand, sort of what lane she was running in, and they tried to sort of become the compromise candidate, and you don't become a compromise. You are chosen as a compromise on some level. But But Bernie is it's like two basketball teams. One that is, playing a running game. The other is playing a post-up game. It's like, you don't play their game. And Sanders couldn't play their game if he wanted to. Right. And Trump has no ability to play any other game. Warren could have been that candidate, but give me a sense of Warren's candidacy.
Yeah, I mean, but it's frustrating because with Warren, the one thing that you really need if you're going to run against Donald Trump is you really need a powerful sense that you are authentic, that you're not a calculating Washington politician, right? And Warren has done things that give a sense of inauthenticity, that give a sense that, she's trying to figure out what her beliefs should be for the purposes of the campaign. Should I say the word single payer? Is that good? Is that not good? Maybe I should just say Medicare for all and then kind of not say that it's going to be something that takes away private health insurance. And that really hurts her because then people are like, oh, well, I don't trust you, right? And, I think it does hurt Warren that she has a long history of, changing her politics. Right? I mean, yeah, she spent 40 years as a Republican or whatever. She was a Republican until her 40s. People can change. It helps Bernie, though, that he has been doing this since he was 18, getting dragged away from the civil rights protest. Right? With Warren, she changed and evolved, but also, she's gotten much more radical for the purposes of this campaign, where she started talking way more like Bernie Sanders on a bunch of things. On foreign policy, she's very evasive. She has, I actually think the Native American thing is horrible for her because if authenticity is the issue, it's an issue where, she might have spent decades, kind of pretending to be a Native American without not being one. It's going to really hurt her that, she doesn't have this powerful sense of who she really, really is that Bernie Sanders is able to convey to people. And you can see in the way that they talk to voters who disagree with them. But, Bernie's so good at, flipping Trump voters in, 3 minutes by getting them to trust him, by explaining, his core convictions, and they turn around and they come on board. And I just, I don't think Warren has this kind of organizer's mentality. I don't think she has the long track record of fighting that she's going to be able to point to. And I think she's just weak on a bunch of issues and waffling and vacillating in a way that is going to allow Trump to exploit it and is not going to play well with voters.
Let me dissent a little bit from your view to a certain extent. I think that she's I disagree that she's inauthentic, and I think her policies have been pretty remarkably consistent, and she has been a fighter for a lot of these same values. I don't think she has the same take necessarily on power that Bernie would, but in the end, I'm not sure that from a practical implication at this day and age and this era would necessarily make a difference. I think the problem has been really just sheer political. Now, I think Bernie has an advantage because he can afford to not have political savvy, because that's just not the kind of politician he has been his entire career. He hasn't had to be a politician because he hasn't been in a position where he is, he just has one position and has been on that for a long time. And by political, I mean, I think, made a political miscalculation in responding to the question, how are you going to pay for your Medicare for all? I think she made a political miscalculation in trying to present a plan as to how you're going to roll it out. Bernie has not provided the level of detail in paying for it as Warren has. And his rollout plan, the only thing that she, I think, made a mistake about was to say it was going to be in 2 tranches. She didn't need to do that. I think there is a lack of confidence. Too many times we look at politics and say, what lane are you going to be in? And we define that ideologically, as opposed to what lane are you going to be in strong and wrong or detail bogged down and precise, or there are other lanes that I think voters see. And I think that when she felt like she had to respond to, I don't think that her belief that she was, had a Native American ancestry was nearly as egregious as the idea that she needed to respond to Donald Trump about it. F you, Donald Trump.
Well, yeah,
my mom told me that we were, whatever. Everybody understands in this country some idea of like, I thought we came from Hungary. It turns out I came from Poland. They sell all the 23andMe's based upon that, right? Like everybody understands that concept. Yeah. Why feel like you have to address him to explain it? Why feel like you have to address anybody? Stick to your beliefs, stay with it. And I think it has become, at least in my mind, a concern about her political apparatus, which is developed by, her advisors are picked by her. And at the end of the day, like it shows a vulnerability that I would be concerned about in a general election.
She definitely responds too much to Trump. I mean, she rolled out her campaign with the DNA test video.
Exactly.
And I don't even know if the DNA test was supposed to be like, I am actually a Native American, right? Because the whole point of presenting a DNA test is to say that you're right. Like, or she's not. Like, she's backing off. Like,
well, she clearly believed that she was. And so the idea being that, like, exactly, like, why are you responding to Donald Trump? The only way you're going to beat Donald Trump is by showing the American public that this guy's a joker, and he's a joker by you don't address him. Like, go after yourself. Yeah. I don't need to justify anything to you, Donald Trump. And frankly, we're in an era where we want our politicians to say we don't need. I mean, I think that's why Biden, frankly, to the extent that he has the support he does. Everything that I find offensive about Joe Biden, I think, is part of the reason why he's doing as well as he does. Because he goes, bless me, Father, for I have sinned, is his way of saying, go F yourself.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's funny because I think, many of the left criticisms of Biden aren't really landing because, like, the fact that he's rambling does mean that he's, like, very much an unscripted politician, right? He's not robotic. You never know what's going to come out of his mouth. That kind of his his confrontations with voters. I don't know. They might actually help him. He's got like a Trump-like quality to him, which is to like go F yourself. I don't care what anyone thinks.
But anyways, interesting discussion on that. But the real point is, folks, why you should be a socialist. Nathan J. Robinson, the editor of Current Affairs. We will put a link to that at majority.fm. I think this is a great present to give to your cousin or your niece or nephew or your uncle or your aunt to push them over the edge. And now is the time. Nathan Robinson, thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Hey, thanks, Sam. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.